Hi guys, so today's video is kind of based on a Sky News article thing that I saw going around which really interested me. So I'm going to put it on the screen for you. Prince William deeply concerned, in quotation marks, after children, in quotation marks, racially abused during football matches. In a letter seen by Sky News, the royal confirmed he had been in touch with the FA about the claims, saying racism and abuse has no place in our society. It says here that Prince William has written to a grassroots football club condemning the racism its players and coaches have faced. He's supposed to be deeply concerned, and he thinks that those involved must be held accountable. I'm not going to read the whole article out, I'll link it because I don't want to get in trouble. I don't know what the rules are in terms of how much you can read. He also wrote this quote: "Racism and abuse has no place in our society. Abhorrent behaviour of this nature must stop now, and all those responsible be held to account." Okay, so it also says here that the heir to the throne is the president of the Football Association. So just for me as an anti-monarchist, like, that is just ridiculous. Like, why is he head of the Football Association? There's so many people who are so much more into football, knowledgeable about football, skillful in that area, who I'm sure would be great in that position. But basically, I think it was the hypocrisy of it that really struck me. And I think this is something that, going forward, when we look at racism and how we can be progressive and anti-racist ourselves, something we're seeing more and more frequently, and I talk about a lot in my videos, is that in this age of like imagery, optics and branding, we are seeing figures that are actually deeply problematic themselves, or institutionally racist or whatever, with huge problems in them. We are seeing them now start to use the language of being progressive as a sort of shield, as an optics thing. So they've kind of caught onto the terminology. Basically what they're doing is cheapening anti-racism and anti-racist work and anti-racist campaigning by essentially using it to make themselves look good, but without ever actually commenting on it. And of course, it's very easy for them to do this, because if you look at, it's very performative. It's like the time to talk mental health thing, right? Where we want to say, we all say, oh, you've got mental health issues, let's talk about that, let's be more open-minded. But it's sort of like, but if we're not doing anything to actually break down the stigma, about people that act in different ways or are, neurodivergent, if we still have a lot of ableism and we mock people for being different emotionally, or we call them like whingers, or we laugh at people who talk about their trauma, it's just nothingness, right? It's just completely muddying the waters, and if it's not about, funding the services and actually helping people, it doesn't make any sense. And the same thing is happening with racism, which is incredibly disturbing, because it actually gets in the way of actually combating racism. Because what we know is that in the society we live in, at least here in the UK, in Britain, if you're somebody who genuinely stands up against racism, that is something which is going to impact you in a negative manner. Because look at what's happened, for example, to Harry. So Harry is somebody who, obviously has made mistakes in his past, but has come forward through that, has put himself out there, and he put out that statement, didn't he? A while ago, when he saw that Meghan was getting racial abuse, he was really horrified by it. And even though the palace was saying to him, don't do that, that's not what we do, it like puts a target on your back, it's not what we do, he decided that the right thing to do was to take the anti-racist position in that situation. And from that point onwards, we have seen this like incredible smear campaign which is still going, which I think is basically because he is seen as a traitorous white man. He is a traitor, and they do this to like proper anti-racists as well. I'm not undermining Harry as an anti-racist, but as in people who are actually activists. Like, for example, Jeremy Corbyn has been an anti-racist campaigner for like his whole life, and he's faced a very similar situation to Harry, but in the political sphere. So you've got people who are actually taking part in racism and who are upholding the status quo, and don't really want to sort out the institutions, then framing people who speak out against racism as the dangerous individuals. So everything is kind of twisted around, and that's the kind of climate we're in right now, because people have got smart. Branding teams have made these things completely meaningless. Because we've now got Prince William able to come forward and be like, oh yeah, racism's wrong and abuse is wrong. And he's being presented by the media, who fawn over him because of whatever contract they've got with the royals, as, wow, good for him, he's against racism. But what actually happened, for example, when Harry put out the statement protecting Meghan, right, and saying that, quite obviously, we would just take this for granted, right? It wasn't like a it wasn't a controversial thing to say, or it shouldn't have been, but it was in Britain because we are more racist than we care to admit here, although it's a lot more veiled. You wouldn't think that simply saying, I see the racist undertones here, and I think that's disgusting, would be controversial. But remember how that went down in the palace. So what we had was when Harry put out that statement, because he was so horrified by what he was seeing, William and Charles were said to be furious at him, right? They were worried that it would make them look bad. So their priority in that moment was their own self-image rather than racism, right? Most people in a situation of racism, I would think, prioritize the racism, right? You would think, okay, that stuff doesn't really matter. The racism is the bad thing, let's stand together against it. But they were thinking about their brand, what that meant for them. And bizarrely, they were angry at him because they said that Harry was basically showing them up. Now, I would say, if you're not racist yourself, why does that show you up? Why would somebody saying, I do not agree with racism, which I would have thought is like, it's just common sense. I would hope most people would say that. But apparently they don't. How is that making you look bad? Like, they could have put their name to the statement also. They actually made it so Harry striking out on his own to do that. They kind of made him do that on his own and then take the hits for being a white man who stood up against racism. And they were like, oh, it made us look bad. Like, you've hurt us somehow. Like, with no awareness of the hurt that meant to Meghan, the hurt to Meghan enduring that. And not just to Meghan, but to all people of colour, to mixed race people watching this unfold in Britain. And it is terrifying because Meghan is somebody who was willing to assimilate in. She wasn't like, there would be nothing wrong, by the way, if she was like somebody who was more outspoken about stuff, if she was wanting to change things more, all those things would be fine. But she was really on her very best behaviour, right? She didn't do anything wrong. And she's also quite light-skinned as well. So I think seeing this level of abuse, hitting Meghan was disturbing for so many of us. Not just on an empathy level for her and her feelings, which is important, but also the fact that it really demonstrated British racism. The thing with racism, which is so awful, is that you can't step away from it. It's racist, think about it as you kind of being tainted by your blood, right? Your DNA, which is why it was so disturbing when they were talking about Meghan's blood changing the royal family's DNA. It's something that you can't escape. Because, Meghan is somebody who looks in some ways racially ambiguous. But even Meghan, right, and she did everything they wanted. Like, she really did. She tried so hard to make it work. She was seen as too different, tainted by her blood. There were still conversations about, oh no, like, what will their child look like? Should she really be here? The thing with racism is that you can't assimilate in. You can try to a point. But the thing with racism, it's the idea that you are inherently inferior because of your race, which is what we saw happening to Meghan. And that it was just really scary, especially in this time period where we feel like we've gone so far forward, because she did everything right. And I think a lot of us were thinking, a lot of us don't deal with stuff as well as Meghan did. I don't know how I'd deal with things. I'm like kind of racially ambiguous and often white presenting or white passing. I don't know what the phrasing is, sorry. We usually say white passing but here, but maybe that's not right. But I don't think I could have kept as much grace as Meghan, honestly. I think I would have at some point got really angry and snapped back and just felt frustrated. The fact that she did everything right, she was so measured, she was so graceful, it was like she didn't put a single foot wrong, she didn't once lose her temper, and yet they've still monstered her, is a threat to every person of colour here in Britain. Because how many of us genuinely can carry ourselves like that? Like, it's really scary. And again, she's not somebody who is, you wouldn't necessarily look at Meghan and immediately know her racial mix. So that's really scary. But back to William's statement. So he's talking about how he's, against racism, against children, etc. And this is a man who, when his niece and nephew, and this is his children's cousins, right? Which I hope they have a relationship with each other in later life. I hope that, they're not being so indoctrinated and groomed as to, don't go near the outsiders. And people are saying, and they're right, I think this is true, that part of the reason why Harry and Meghan are being monstered is because they are people outside the family. I've seen a couple of people comment this on the videos, and you're absolutely right, I'm of the same mind. That's a way out. There's somebody outside the family who you can go to if you don't want to do this anymore. So they have to completely monster them. So I'm afraid that the children are going to be, intimidated by that and want to stay away from that family. But if you really cared about racism against children, where was your statement for Archie and Lily? If you have the power, people think in Britain we have this thing where racism is so veiled. Like, people will think, like, someone could be attacked in, like, a hate crime. But if there wasn't a specific slur being said at the time, or it wasn't caught on camera, or even if that was said at the time, there will still be people who argue, oh, but maybe it wasn't a hate crime, maybe it was just like a disagreement. Like, people won't accept racism in Britain, like, unless an actual slur is being said. And even then, sometimes they'll be like, oh, but, it was just a joke kind of thing. We have a very, very weird and scary attitude towards racism here. And something I wanted to talk about in another video is, you might know about Jane Elliott. So she's an anti-racist. And she is, I believe she's American. So she's a teacher who became a sort of educator in anti-racism. I don't know if she was an elementary school teacher. I'm not sure what their school years are like in America, but they were like little kids, and she'd been teaching the kids about Martin Luther King. This was like back in the 60s. And he was like their hero of the week. And then it happened to be that in that week he was assassinated. And she was just devastated and realised she had to do something. Like, she had to explain it to the kids, but she also had to create what she later defined as an inoculation against racism. So she created this kind of experiment project kind of thing called the Brown Eyes, Blue Eyes experiment, which was quite controversial at the time, but it was meant to kind of demonstrate how racism is more than just like a slur. It's like feelings of worthlessness and powerlessness, and it's all about structures, right? It's about grinding people down and forcing them into the stereotypes you've made for them because you've ground them into nothing. It's how people of colour or an oppressed minority group are kind of facing so much more anyway that they're going to become sometimes more reactive. They might not cope very well with things. They might deliberately be excluded from job opportunities and things, and then people will turn around and use that abuse against them and say, oh, look, such and such a group is, oh, look, they're poor people, they live in bad areas, or they're this or they're that. Anyway, she did that experiment, I think in the 2000s here in Britain, and she did it with adults, and it is one of the most infuriating things I have ever seen in my life, and I'm going to make a whole video about it because we need to analyse it, because that is British racism. What you see in that experiment is British racism, like, described. Like, I don't think I've ever seen British racism like demonstrated like that. And the racism from people is so bad that, and the also arrogance that we have here in Britain, about, we're good, we're the heroes, we're Great Britain, means that actually members of the public, as part of that test, who've agreed to go into the experiment, actually hijack the test, to the extent that they stop other people learning the lesson because they're so entitled. So there will be a video for that. But racism in Britain is complicated. It's very complicated. You cannot be, in my mind, a real anti-racist. If William cared about racism that much, what did you do when your actual niece and nephew were getting racial abuse? Like, you haven't said a word. And I believe if you have the power to stop racism, right, if you do have that power and privilege, then it is your duty, especially in a position, like a public position, like William's. It is your job. It's just not even in terms of his job in the royal family, just in terms of family and humanity anyway. That's your duty to speak out. You don't get to sit there and be silent and let Meghan get the racial abuse and let the children get racial abuse and then let Harry be smeared because he's seen as a race traitor. And my honest opinion here is that regardless of, I don't know in private what William thinks about these things. I can speculate, but I don't know. But what I do know, and what seems to me to be the case, is that he and his father have found the racism convenient and have at the very least allowed it and not put a stop to it because it's useful to them, right? It's like there's a ready-made target on Meghan, on that mixed family and those children that already comes from a societal bias in Britain. And they didn't contradict it. They haven't put themselves out to change anything because it's in their interests. Now, in their minds, and a lot of people in Britain think like this, they might even be under the illusion that, oh, we're not racist, we didn't say anything racist, I don't know, maybe they have in private, I don't know, but publicly, we didn't say anything racist, we weren't the ones doing the racism, we're not racist. They don't understand, as so many people here don't, that it's also, you're still part of racism. You can be passively racist if you see racism happening to people who have less power than you, and you have the power and the position to do something about it, and you don't. I believe they've used that racism to their advantage. The racism against those children, and this is a horrible, horrible thing to say, makes their children safer. It does. Racism against those mixed race kids makes the racists kind of put George and Charlotte and Louis on a higher pedestal, which I would argue is still incredibly dangerous, because we don't know, what if they fall in love with people of different races, or they might not be straight, they might be gay when they grow up. We don't know. But playing into that system never helps anyone in the long run. It's just never a good idea. It's just very rich to me to see him talking about racism and abuse, right, against kids. And it's an absolute joke, especially talking about like institutionalized problems, as if the very institution he's part of does not have a history of racism built into it. And the one person in the family who actually wanted to address it and change it was smeared and attacked, and physically attacked, by William. Like, how is this being printed? And our press is so subservient, right? They don't question any of it. They just let it happen, Oh wow, William said something anti-racist. He doesn't like racism against children. Your words don't match your action. In this age of branding, you have to look at people's like actual actions here. Because anyone can say, oh yeah, I'm against racism. Not to bring it to Succession, which is my current obsession, but there's like a kind of joke in Succession where there's like a really, really right-wing news station, and one of the characters, who isn't quite as bad as the others at this point, points out that, I don't know, he feels uncomfortable because it's a bit racist. Like, the news is quite racist and quite toxic. And he says, I do have morals, like, I'm against racism. And his friend says, completely seriously, well, obviously, we're all against racism, right? Come on, we're all against racism. While they're working for the racist news station. Like, people in Britain don't understand that racism can be completely passive, right? There is an entitlement, there is a feeling of anger when they're accused of racism. I don't know how it is elsewhere, but sometimes what you'll see here is people being more angry at being accused of racism than they are about racism. And I don't understand that, because if you're not racist and you're accused of being racist, then surely, like, why is that? Wouldn't you just be like, well, I'm not? But the anger, and that's why we have, I don't know, we have the thing woke, don't we? We have the term woke. And I feel like this is the new way that racism's growing in the modern age. Like, because racism has to keep moving and shifting, and it has to keep veiling itself. So have you noticed how woke has become the new word they'll use? Like, say, for example, a black actor is cast in a role, and you'll get loads of people saying, oh, I hate how woke everything is. And it's like, in that context, that's just racism. Because you're looking at that person, and you're now using woke. Woke is the acceptable new word to use. As if we can't tell it's racist. It's racist. Actually, there was, I think I've got it here. So there's a conservative author in the US called Bethany Mandel. I don't know anything about her, but I did see this on Twitter. She's written a book centered around the term woke, but when she was in an interview, I don't know if she was on CNN, she was on CNN, she was asked to define what woke means, and she couldn't do it. And she'd written a book on it. And I understand sometimes we all get nervous on the spot and we don't answer, but she just couldn't answer it. And I honestly feel this is an intelligent academic, right? She obviously is writing a book, she's written a book, she knows the subject very well. The reason they don't want to define woke isn't because they can't define woke. I've seen a lot of people saying, oh, people can't even define it. It's more sinister than that, in my view. They can define it, but there's no way to actually define it without admitting that it is just racism, sexism, homophobia. It's just their word they use instead to get away with it. Anyway, that just really frustrated me. Like, I see that a lot. I see a lot of people suddenly being like, oh yeah, I'm anti-racist, I hate racism, public figures when it's useful. But then they don't actually want to put themselves in the firing line. And I get it, it's scary to do that. Look what they've done to Harry. But then don't go around saying you're an anti-racist. Like, look what they did to Jeremy Corbyn, for example. Like, we know there's a cost. But don't go around calling yourself an anti-racist if you're going to let racism happen and just sit there and benefit from it. Like, you, at the very least, don't then sit there and act like you're very concerned about racism, because you had no concerns. You left it to your little brother to take that all on his own, all that fire, when it didn't have to be that way, because William and Charles could so easily have just added their names to the statement, uncontroversially, and just said, yeah, also, we don't like the racism towards Meghan. because they have power among royalists. But they know that a lot of their support base, unfortunately, are racist. They're incredibly conservative. Like, I don't just mean conservative in terms of like Tory, I mean like right wing, you know, all the old power structures, etc. And part of why they like the royals, a lot of that is far right stuff, right? It's symbolism, it's the superiority of whiteness, and they know that's part of their following, and they don't want to alienate that base. But if they were actually anti-racist, they wouldn't care, and they would actually want to get rid of that base. Anyway, thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed. If you can enjoy a video about racism. Lots of love, and I'll see you really soon. All right, love you. Bye.